So again, I'll introduce myself. I'm David Fass. I'm the trainer at InetSoft. So I do these short trainings, and I also do larger trainings. Some of you may have been here in weeks, in months past, so you know the basic idea of these webinars is just to give you a kind of a quick introduction to various features of the product. All right, so this session will continue in that vein, and what we're going to look at today, hopefully everybody can see my screen, is adding filters to a dashboard. Right. So this is a pretty basic topic when you're designing dashboards. A dashboard without filters is not a very interesting dashboard. So by filters I mean selection elements, right? So we've got, this is a selection list for categories. This is a selection tree for for multiple levels, selecting multiple levels in a hierarchy, range sliders, calendars, selection container, and then we'll look at some other mechanisms for filtering as well. Okay, so if anybody during the training, if we have any audio problems or anything like that, please type in the question box or in the chat box so that I can immediately try to troubleshoot what's happening. Okay, so let's get started. And again, I welcome any questions. Just type them in the question box. I believe everyone is muted by default. So if you're, oh, there's a question. Okay, thank you. Okay, so another person who can hear me. Okay, so so yeah, if you want to ask a question, just feel free to type in the question box. Don't try to ask the question verbally because I can't hear you. So typing is the preferred method. Okay, so so what I have here somewhere in the background here, I've got my portal up and running, and what I'm going to do is open up a very simple dashboard that I already created. It just has a couple of charts, and this will just give us basically a kind of a substrate to experiment with some of these selection elements. So the dashboard that I created I called webinar filtering. Pardon me. And you can see that it just has a couple of charts, right? So there's nothing really remarkable about these charts. If anybody's curious about how I created them or anything like that, feel free to ask me at the end of the session. But they're pretty basic. So let's take a look at the most basic selection element, which is a selection list. Okay? Selection list is basically a filter that lets you filter generally on a dimension, is what you would use a selection list for. So there's a couple of ways to add one. Some of this we've done in weeks past, but the quickest and easiest way to add a selection list is just to grab the field that you want to filter. So let's say I wanted to filter the category field, right over there. I just grab that field from my data source, and I just drag it into the dashboard. Right, and that's it. That's a selection list. It's a filter. I can, of course, make it a little bit bigger if I want. And if I make selections in this list, right, what you'll notice is that it's filtering the two charts. Right, so I've selected educational and graphics, and those are the only two categories that I see in this chart. That's pretty apparent over here. But what might not be as apparent is that the bottom chart is also filtered. Right? So as I make these different selections, you'll see the bottom chart changing to the bottom chart showing me data only for the items that I've selected. And so that's essentially the most basic type of selection that you can do. But let me show you a few interesting things, even in this most simple kind of selection scenario. And we can experiment by adding another selection list. So let's see if I can pick a good one here. How about company? I'll add the company selection list. Right, just the same way. I just drag the field into the dashboard. And I'm also going to add state. So of course you can add selections on many different fields. You can add filtering on many different fields, and that's quite typical that you would have more than one selection element. And so here's an example of where we have several selection elements. several selection lists. Now, what I want to show you is a little bit of the interaction between these selection elements, because this is an important part of dashboard filtering. So what I'll do is I'll clear this top selection list. So now all the selection lists are clear, and basically I'm seeing all of the data. Okay, well, let's see what happens if I select just a few of these companies, right? So if I select AMG Logistics, I'll just select the first three. Okay. What you'll notice is that, first of all, the charts are filtered as expected. So both of these charts are now showing me data only sales to these three companies. So that's pretty much as expected. But what is sometimes a little bit less expected is that the other selection lists update in response to the selections that I make. Right? So you'll notice that in the category selection list, I see a bunch of green squares. And in the state selection list, I see a couple of green squares, and then this plus others indicator. So let's explore a little bit about what this means. So the green check mark for the ones that I've selected should be pretty self-explanatory. That means that I explicitly selected those values. That's what the green check mark means. The green box means that the values that are marked with the green box were not explicitly selected, but they nevertheless are present in the result set. What that means is that because I selected AMG Logistics, Big Ed's BBQ, and Big Mart Food Stores, right, those three companies have sales in these categories. So if I look into the data set that's displayed in these charts, I would find sales in these categories that are marked with the green box. Okay, and of course the empty box, when you see an empty box, that means you can just click in that box to add, to expand the result set. So if I wanted to expand the result set with the records for sales to a company called Computer Tech, I would just select that one. Now the result set gets bigger, and you can see that this selection list down here, the state selection list, now shows 3 different states, meaning that those 3 states are present in the result set. So again, if I were to look into the data that's being returned to be displayed in these charts, I would find in there only 3 states, because I've selected only 4 companies, and those 4 companies are basically in these 3 states. Okay. So that's a little bit of the how these selection lists interact. Let's go a little bit further, and let's say that I now go to the state selection list, and let's say I want to restrict the result set to only sales in Massachusetts. All right, so I know that I've got sales in the result set right now. There's sales from 3 states. If I click one of these green boxes, what I'm effectively doing is restricting the result set. So I'm going to select MA. Right, so now I'm only looking at data from sales in Massachusetts. Now you can see again that the other 2 selection lists have changed, and in particular, if you look at the company selection list, you'll notice that 3 of the items, the Big Ed's BBQ, Big Mart Food Stores, and Computer Tech, are now marked with a gray check mark. Now what that means is that I explicitly had selected those items, but because of a subsequent choice, in other words, because I selected Massachusetts as the state, those values are no longer in the result set. And what I'm seeing instead are simply the sales to AMG Logistics in Massachusetts. Okay, so what you'll find is that when you make selections in a particular selection list, that may make modifications to selections that you have made in other selection lists, right? So all of these selection components are coupled together. So, so basically what we've seen so far are 4 different symbols. We've seen a green check mark. That means you selected it and it's in the result set. We've seen a green box, which means you did not select it, but it's nevertheless in the result set. At least, you know, some values, some records with those values are in the result set. The empty box means you have not selected it and it is not in the result set, but you can select it if you wish to expand the result set. And then I think that was 4, right? So yeah, so that's 4. And then there's a 5th icon, which I'll show you down here. So if you look down at the state selection list, if I click on the plus others, then you'll see that there are other states here listed, and they're all marked with a gray X. Right, so that's the fifth of the possible symbols that you might see. The gray X means that these selections are incompatible with other selections that you've made. And effectively what that means is that if you were to make one of these selections, that together with some other selection that you made would result in an empty data set. Right, so for example, I've selected AMG Logistics explicitly. If I were to explicitly select Florida, well, there are no records that have both company AMG Logistics and state Florida, so there would be effectively no data returned. But what you'll see is that that's not what happens because we prevent that from happening. So instead, to prevent an empty result set from being returned, when you click on one of these incompatible entries marked with a gray X, like Florida, what it will do is it will reset your other selections. So since I selected Florida, now the dashboard basically says, oh, you want data from Florida? Well, in that case, I can't give you what you selected in, in the company selection list, and instead it's just honoring the most recent selections that I made. Okay, so that's just a quick tour of the some of the interactivity of these different selection elements. Okay, let's take a look at some of the other selection components that you can consider adding, beginning with a selection tree. So I'm going to delete these guys, and now we're just back to our two charts. Selection tree is a way to give the user the ability to make selections at multiple levels of hierarchy. The easiest way to add one of these guys is to simply find the selection tree in the list here, right? So under the selection folder, there's selection tree, and you just drag in a blank selection tree. Right, and this would be convenient, for example, if we wanted to be able to filter both on category and on product. Right? So category and product are two levels of a hierarchy. Right? So within each category, there are a set of products that belong to that category. So that's a perfect example of hierarchy. Another example would be state and city. Right? That would also make a good hierarchy. But let's stick with category and name and product name. So I'm going to, I've got this blank selection tree, and now I'm going to grab the category field and just drag that into the selection tree. Right? And what that gives me is just a one-level selection tree. Now if I were to leave it at that, this is no different than a selection list, as you can see. However, I can find another field, preferably one that has a hierarchical relationship with the existing field. For example, the name field, these are product names, and I know that products are grouped into categories, so I can just drag that name field right into the same selection tree, and it will add that as another level of the hierarchy. Right? And you can make as many levels of hierarchy as you want, although there's a practical, from a usability standpoint, generally 3 levels of hierarchy is probably the limit of the patience of anyone. Nobody wants to have to drill down too far to find what they want. So, so here you go. So here's a selection tree, and what this means is that you can make selections now either at the category level. So I could select business, right? And I see the category of business, all of the products in the category of business, or I can drill down to the product level and make selections of individual products. Let's say Easy Chess and Fast Go Game, right? Those are 2 products in the games category. And from the hardware category, maybe I'll select 17-inch LCD, whoops, and a wireless keyboard. And I don't know, something else, 19-inch LCD. Okay, so basically it allows me to make selections at multiple levels of hierarchy. Now there is an option, in some cases people have data where the hierarchy is structured using parent and child IDs, and in the event that your data is structured that way, you can actually build a selection tree on that basis as well. If you right-click and go into Properties here, under Data, right, so this is I opened up the Properties dialog box for the selection tree. There is an option to either use columns, which is what we're doing here. We're just selecting columns that happen to have a hierarchical relationship. But in the event that your data actually explicitly defines parent and child IDs, you can actually build the selection tree based off of those explicit relationships as well. Okay, let's take a look at some other types of selections. back on the slide here, we'll take a look at filtering date data and numerical data. Right? And typically these are filtered using range sliders. The easiest way to add these kinds of range sliders is, again, just to drag a field into the dashboard. So if you want to filter dates, you can grab a date field and just drag it in, right? And that will give you a range slider that filters dates. Right? And the operation of this is pretty straightforward. You can move the end handles, and then you can drag the slider body, and you can see that the slider here, the date slider, is filtering both of these charts. It's more apparent on the bottom chart, of course, because the x-axis gives us the different months. So you can see that the selection that I've made on the range slider corresponds to the data that I'm seeing in the chart, but it's also filtering the top chart as well. Okay, so that's an example of a range slider for dates. Now, you don't have to use a range slider for dates. In some cases, it might make sense to use, for example, a selection list for dates. But how would you do that, right? How would you, we know that if you simply drag the date field in, you're going to get a range slider. So what if you had a date field that perhaps only had a few distinct dates in it, and you wanted the user to be able to select using a selection list from that short list of dates? What you can do is you can, first of all, add a blank selection list. Right? So you can find the selection list component in the selection folder, add that over there, and then into that blank selection list you can put the date field. And it will actually give you a warning saying that, hey, that's unusual. But you can say yes, and in that event, then what you're going to get is basically a selection list that gives you a list of the dates. Okay, now, as I was hinting at, this may be more or less useful depending on the way that your data is structured. So in this case, because these dates are individual sales dates, this becomes quite a long selection list, and probably pretty tedious to choose dates this way. However, if you had a date field that maybe the only values in there were the months, right? You had different months, or you had different years because the data was already grouped, then it might make more sense to do this, because then you could have a list of, let's say, 10 different years. The user could select the year from there, and maybe that would be easier than using a range slider. Okay, so anyway, it's another approach that you can consider. Okay, as far as numerical fields go, right, so that's a date field. As far as numerical fields go, the situation is basically the same. Typically, numerical fields are filtered using a range slider, and again, the easiest way to do it is find a numerical field, let's say quantity purchased, and you just drag it into the dashboard, and that gives you a range slider right off the bat. And the operation is the same, right? So I'm just selecting a range of quantities, and the data in the two charts is just showing me records that match that range, right, for which the quantity purchased of that order is in the range right now 8 to 14. Okay, so that's an example of using a range slider to select numerical values. And as with the date, you can, if you want, you can also use a selection list for that purpose. So I can add a selection list here, right, just a blank selection list, and then into there I can drop a numerical field, let's say total. Well, actually, let's try quantity purchased. It's a better candidate. Right, so I can drop quantity purchased in there, and then basically what that gives you is a selection list from which you can select different quantities purchased. Right? So in some cases, you might prefer to provide the user with this interface. Let me get rid of, it would be weird to have two interfaces simultaneously. So what you could do is you could provide the user with this kind of interface, and then they can basically select discrete values. So if they want to look at only records where the quantity purchased was 14, they can select just that one, 14 and 5. Right, so it gives the user a different way, kind of a more precise way of selecting. And again, the choice of which approach you use, range slider versus selection list, it just depends on your application and the kind of interface that you want to show to the user. Okay, let's take a look at some other kinds of selections. The calendar. Calendar is another way to select dates. Right, so we've already seen that you can use a range slider to select dates. You can use a selection list if you want to select dates, And there's also a calendar. So let's take a look at how the calendar works. So in the selection folder here, you're going to find calendar right over there, calendar. All right, so I'm going to grab a calendar and put it over here. And basically what a calendar is another way to select a range of dates, but we'll see that it has another feature as well. So first of all, selecting a range of dates. The first thing after you add the calendar component is that you need to associate the calendar with a particular date field. Right? So right now we've got a calendar, but it's not filtering anything because it does not know what it's supposed to filter. Right? We haven't told it which date field to filter. So let's do that. And the way you do it is you find the date field. Right? In this data set, in this sales data block, there is only one date field, but in other data sets, of course, you might have an order date and a return date and a processing date or whatever. So you'd have to choose which date field the calendar is supposed to filter on. So in this case, I'll just grab the date field, drag it right onto the calendar, and drop it there. All right, so now this calendar, when I make selections on the calendar, it's going to be filtering that date field and effectively filtering the entire data block based on the dates. So let's give it a try. By default, when you have a calendar like this, you can select weeks. Right, so I'm going to select a week here, right, or a week there. Right, and you can see that it's filtering the two charts. The bottom chart becomes kind of meaningless if I'm selecting weeks because that I basically get one data point since the x-axis on this chart is grouped by month. If I just select a single week, that just gives me a single data point. So this is not the best calendar if you have a chart like that, but you can see that it is effectively filtering. You can select multiple weeks by shift-clicking or by control-clicking. I think right now I'm in Google Chrome and I have a problem with Google Chrome, so I can't demonstrate that, but take my word for it, if you shift-click or control-click, you should be able to select multiple weeks here. Now, there are various other ways that you can set up a calendar. So, for example, in this case, because we're looking at months in the bottom chart, what I might want to be able to do is to select a range of months. And so to do that, first of all, I would switch the calendar to the year view. There's a button here in this little mini toolbar in the title bar. If you press that switch to year view button, now it's going to show months rather than days. Right? And so I can select a range of months. Actually, yeah. Right? So something like this. I'm selecting February 2014 to June 2014. Right? So that's a range of months. And you can see that both charts update, but it's clearest from the bottom chart that the chart is in fact being filtered based on the calendar. Now, what if you want to select across years, right? So you want to, let's say I want to select July of 2012 to July of 2013, right? That would be tricky here. But what you can do is you can expand the calendar into 2 pages. So there's the middle button here called Switch to Range/Comparison. If I press that, right, now I get a 2-sided calendar. And now I can select across years pretty easily. So I can go, I'm using the paging controls here at these little arrows, move me backwards and forwards through the years. And if you want to select the entire year, by the way, you can click on the year itself. But what I want to do is select July 2012 to July 2013. And if you look in the title bar, you can see it gives you some feedback as to what you've selected, right? 7/2012 to 7/2013. Now you'll notice that nothing happened when I made that selection, and that's because when you have a 2-page calendar like this, you have to press the apply button here to get the selection submitted. So I'm going to press the green apply button in the mini toolbar up there, right? And now it's going to show me that range. So I've got July 2012 to July 2013, and that's for both charts. Both of the charts are showing me only data from that range. Okay, so that's some basic stuff that you can do with a chart. With a calendar. There is another nifty thing that you can do with a calendar, and that is you can actually do a comparison of dates. So let's say that I wanted to compare January 2012 to January 2013. right, in this top chart here. So what I can do is there's another button here called Switch to Comparison Mode. Okay, so press Switch to Comparison Mode. Right, and you can see now that basically that forces onto the chart a comparison. So now I can select January 2012, select January 2013, press the little green Apply button, and it's going to give me a comparison of those 2 months, January 2013 versus January 2012, and the same over here. Although over here, this is not the best chart to do that because it ends up breaking it down into days, basically comparing the different days from the different months. So as to whether that's meaning the calendar into comparison mode forces a comparison into the charts that you have that are based on the same data block. Okay, so that's a calendar. Let's take a look at the last of the selection components, which really is not itself a selection component. It's just a container for selection components. So let's see how this thing works. Okay, so I'm going to first of all find the selection container. Right, it's right here. It's together with the other selection components, and you drop that in. And then basically what this is a kind of a host for placing other selection components. So I can put selection components in here, such as a category selection list, just dragging it right into the selection container. And I can add, let's say, add also a product. Maybe I want to be able to select products also. So I'm adding a product selection list into the selection container. And then I can also add in numerical and date fields. So I could add a date. I could add a range slider in there for date and a slider in there for total. And so basically, this is a convenient way to package a lot of selection components. So the idea being that rather than scatter these filters all around the dashboard, sometimes it's easier, and users would probably appreciate if all of these selection components are in a single place. That way, at a glance, they can see exactly what selections they've made, and they don't have to go looking all around the dashboard to figure out what the filters are that are currently in operation. Okay, now selection container can do more than just this, right? So all of these things are functional, and you can collapse and expand, different selection elements within a selection container. So it's kind of a space savings trick as well when you have a lot of selection elements. You can also have the selection container display even selections that are not placed within the selection container. So let's say, for example, that I had decided, let me take this out. Let me move this out. So let's say that I had decided to have these range sliders down here for whatever reason, maybe aesthetic reasons or maybe some other reasons I needed to have these down here. Perhaps they, because they're more associated with the chart, I wanted to put them near that chart. Whatever the case is, right? So now I've got a situation where I've got some selection elements up here, some selection elements down there, but I'd still like the user to be able to look in a single place to find out exactly what selections are currently in operation on the dashboard. And you can do that, right? So what you do is you right-click on the selection container, select Properties, okay? And under the Properties here, there's an option to Show Current Selections. Right, show current selections, select that, press OK. Right, and now the selection container will show you any selections that have been made in any other selection elements anywhere in the dashboard. So even if you've got these components that are not in the selection container will show you the current selections. And again, the purpose is that the user can look in just one place and find out everything that's going on the dashboard currently. Now there is one other thing that you can use the selection container for, and that is it provides a way in cases where you want to give your users a little bit more flexibility in terms of modifying the dashboard. You'll notice that there's an option here called Allow User to Add Remove Selections. Right, what this means is that the selection container provides a way for the user to add in additional selection components. So let me illustrate how that works. And to do that, I'm going to remove these ones down here. All right, so let's say that this is the dashboard that we've created, and now a user is going to go, a user is going to be using this dashboard. So I'm going to go back to the portal and see if I can find that dashboard. I guess it's this one. Okay, so there's the dashboard that we created, and now I'm pretending that I'm a user, and I'm looking at this, and let's say that, fine, I'm playing around with the different selection lists, but I suddenly realize that I really need to filter on the date, right? I really need a date filter. Well, I don't have one, right? The designer of the dashboard didn't give me a date filter, so what do I do? So one option is, of course, to pick up the phone and call the guy who designed the dashboard and say, hey, I need a date filter. But another approach is that I can actually add a date filter myself, and the way to do that is to open up the chart editor, which an end user can do if they have permission. There's an edit button in the chart, so I'm going to open the chart editor. And then what I can do from the chart editor, I can find the field that I want to be able to filter, let's say the date field, and I can drag it into the selection container. Right? So I, as an end user, I just gave myself another, basically another tool to work with here, and I might even say to myself, also I'd like to be able to filter quantity purchased, right? And so now I just threw that in there, right? So basically the selection container, if you enable it to allow this, it basically gives the end user the ability to add additional selection controls into the dashboard. Again, this depends on that switch, right? So again, in the selection container, this switch this needs to be on in order for that to happen, and also the user needs access to the chart editors, right? So if you have charts and in the chart properties, if the enable ad hoc editing is turned off, then again the user will not be able to do that because they won't be able to open the chart editor. Okay, so that's another illustration of things that you can do with the selection container. Okay, let me wrap up, and then I'll take any questions. The last thing that I want to get at is that there are, I'm going to remove this, there are other techniques for filtering that you can look at. For example, if you're using data worksheets, right, so many dashboards are based, oh, there's a question. Let me read the question. Oh, there's two questions. If you want to save it to the portal, how do you do it? In other words, oh, I'm sorry, save what? John, what did you want to save to the portal? Okay, I didn't, oh, what you have, what I've developed right here? Well, basically when you save if you save a dashboard into a global scope, so when I go and I do save over here, right, so if I save it under global viewsheet in any of these folders under global viewsheet, then that makes it publicly available to anyone who has read permission on those on that folder. So that's how I get it to the repository. Okay, I see some people are leaving, so but that's the main stuff I wanted to cover. I will cover one more thing though. Here's another question. I have a basic dashboard with months at the x-axis, but in alphabetical order. How do you sort the months in the x-axis to be into correct sequence and not alphabetical order? So I'm assuming it's not then a date field. What you could do, if it's not if it's not actually a date field, if it's just a string field that has month names, I believe you could do a manual sort. So what you can do is in your chart here, you would go to the, so let me see, I don't really have an example. Well, let me just swap in a different example here. Okay, so let's say we had this situation, except that let's say that the categories were actually month names here, right? So you get, by default, you get alphabetical order. Obviously, that's not going to be correct for month names. So I believe you can do a manual sort on that. So if we go, I press this little calculator button, edit dimension button, and I'm going to select under sort, select manual, and that gives me a little edit button here. I can open that up. And then I can move these up or down, and if I want games to be, before business, I can move games up, and that will basically change the sorting order. So that's the first thing that pops into my head. I don't know whether that will work for your case, but if not, you can shoot me an email, and I'll try to see if there's a better solution. Okay, let me illustrate one other thing. Just take a couple more minutes. Oh, there's another question. Okay. So one other thing, and that is that there's other ways to filter other than using selection elements. As I mentioned, if you're basing your dashboard on a worksheet, of course you can always filter at the worksheet level, right? So if you want to have just a static filter that only returns data, let's say from the year 2014, you can always put that at the worksheet level. However, you can also put filters at the dashboard level. So let's say that, let me put this back the way it was, to date and month. Okay, it is date and month. Okay, so let's say that I wanted to put just a static filter on this chart. In other words, I don't want the user to be able to modify the filter. I just want this to be filtered so that it shows only data, let's say, from 2014. All right, so how would I do that? You can just right-click on this. Well, of course, one way to do it is add a selection list and then hide the selection list. That so you could add a selection list with dates, select the dates you want, and then hide that, and that would prevent the user from changing it. But another way is to right-click on the chart, go to condition, and you can add a static condition such as date is in range, let's say this year. Right. This means date is in range 2014. Right. So this is just a static condition that I'm placing on the chart. Press OK, and that just applies a filtering condition to the chart. And there's no opportunity really for the user, the end user, to change that. That's just a permanent filter that I put on the chart as the designer. Right. So that's another way to do filtering, kind of static filtering. But as the last thing, I'll just show you that you can also make that dynamic. So let's say that, let's give you a slightly different case, which is, I'm just going to remove that filter. And the slightly different case is, let's say that you want, let's move up here to the top chart. Let's say that you want the user to be able to select different categories, but you don't want to show them all of the categories, right? So we know that if you add a simple selection list like this, right, so they're going to see all of the categories in that field, right? The category field has, let's say, seven different categories, and the user gets to choose from any of them. But let's say that you're in a situation where you only wanted to show the user maybe, I don't know, 3 categories to choose from. Let's say games, graphics, and hardware, right? So how would you do that? Well, you can actually do that with a static filter by making that filter dynamic. So I'll illustrate this. What I'm going to do is I'll add an input component. And so let's say I can add a checkbox component. Right, so here's a component called a checkbox. Right, this is an input component. It's not a selection component. You can use it for many things. You can use it for modifying properties. But in this case, I'm kind of going to use it in place of a selection element, and we'll see how to do that. So I'm going to add this checkbox, right, and now I'm going to populate this checkbox with some values. So I'm going to go to the properties. I'll just change the name to category selection. The name is just the ID of the component, but whenever you're working with input components, it's always good to give it a meaningful name. So I'll just call this category selection, and then I'm just going to create an embedded list here. So down in the list values area, select edit, and I'm going to add a list. And the values that I want the user to be able to select from are games, and I forgot what the other ones are, so I'll just hardware, let's say. I need to make sure that the values exactly match the value names in the field, right? The labels don't matter, but the values are important, that they actually match the values that exist in the field. And there was a third one, maybe let's just say educational. Education. So I don't remember if it's education or educational, but let's just say education, and we'll see if it breaks or not. Education. Okay, so I'm basically populating this checkbox with a few different options. Okay, there they are. If I make it taller, they'll appear a little bit better. Okay, so there's my checkbox with a few different options, only 3 options. Now the question is, how do I get this to behave as a filter? Okay? And the answer is that I'm going to go and add a static condition to this chart, just like I did before. right? When I said, a static in-range condition, this time I'm going to do a static one-of condition, but then I'm going to make it dynamic to use the checkbox. So here's the way you do it. You can right-click on the chart, select condition, right? And I'm going to add a condition to this chart. The condition is going to be that category is one of, right? And what I could do is at this point, I could select a list of categories here, but that would be a completely static filter. Then the chart would only ever show those categories that I select. What I want to do is I want to use this checkbox over here to give the user the opportunity to select that. So I can, over here, pop up this menu and select variable. And then I'm going to select from this list the name of the input component that I want to basically control this condition. Right, so what I've done here, category selection is the name of that checkbox, as you'll recall. Right, so the condition that I've made is category. I want this chart to display category where category is one of whatever the user selects in that checkbox. So this is basically a way of kind of taking a static condition and making it dynamic, and the purpose of this, again, is to kind of limit the options that the user can select from. Instead of showing them all of the possibilities, I'm just showing them a narrow slice of the possibilities. Right, so I can press OK. Right, and now this checkbox should basically, whoops, I guess it was called educational. Right, yeah. So I have to change that value because you can see that when I select education, nothing happens there. So let me fix that, that problem. So this must have been value needs to be educational. That's the actual name of the value in the field, and then hopefully this will work now. Okay. So anyway, that's basically it. I'm going to wrap up there, and basically what we looked at is the various different selection components that are available: selection list, selection tree, range slider, calendar, and selection container. And then I just illustrated that there are other approaches to filtering beyond those. These are by far the most common when you're designing dashboards. The elements that you find in the selection folder are by far the most common that you'll be using for filtering purposes. But if you find that you want to do something and for whatever reason these aren't getting the job done, keep in mind that there are other approaches to filtering, and with some a little bit of cleverness, you can come up with other ways to achieve what you want. So I'll stop there and I'll take any questions. I'll wait a minute or two because it takes time for people to type. Somebody always asks me, when will the recording be available? And the answer is as